The morning air hung thick with diesel smoke and the metallic scent of blood. April 17th, 1945. Near the town of Grafenwöhr in Bavaria, a convoy of American trucks rumbled to a halt in an open field. Within minutes, soldiers poured out, unloading equipment with practiced efficiency. Canvas bundles, wooden crates, steel poles that glinted in the pale sunlight. And then, something that made the watching German prisoners stop and stare. In less than 3 hours, a fully functioning hospital rose from nothing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Operating rooms, recovery wards, a laboratory, all housed in canvas tents that billowed gently in the spring breeze. Inside those tents, surgeons prepared their instruments under electric lights powered by portable generators. Refrigerated trucks delivered whole blood, kept cold and viable for transfusion. Plasma bottles lined the shelves, and in locked cabinets, vials of penicillin gleamed like liquid gold. Major Heinrich Böhler, a captured Wehrmacht medical officer, watched from behind the barbed wire with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief. He had been a surgeon for 15 years. He had operated in field hospitals from Poland to France, from North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. He knew what a military medical facility required: the infrastructure, the time, the permanent buildings needed to maintain sterile conditions, to house equipment, to keep patients stable. What he was witnessing defied everything he understood about battlefield medicine. "This is impossible," he muttered to the officer beside him, Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, who had commanded a divisional clearing station near Aachen before his capture. "They cannot perform surgery in tents. There is no way to maintain proper sterility, no way to manage shock without a proper hospital. This is a theatre, propaganda." But even as Böhler spoke those words, he saw stretchers being carried into the surgical tent. He saw the coordinated movement of medical staff. He heard the hum of the generators and smelled the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant. And then, against his will, against every certainty he had built over a decade and a half of military service, doubt crept in, because what looked impossible was actually happening. To understand why experienced German medical officers stood in stunned silence that April morning, watching Americans accomplish what they believed could not be done, you must first understand what the Wehrmacht medical system had become by 1945, and more importantly, what it had never been, even at the height of German military power. The German military medical services in World War II operated on a philosophy fundamentally different from that of the Americans. German doctrine emphasized centralization. Wounded soldiers received basic first aid at battalion aid stations, called Truppenverbandplatz, staffed by medics with limited training. From there, they travelled, often for hours or even days, to reach a Hauptverbandplatz, the main dressing station, where more advanced care could be provided. Only at the rear, at permanent field hospitals called Feldlazarets, could serious surgery be performed. This system worked adequately in the early years of the war, when Germany controlled vast territories and could establish semi-permanent medical facilities in requisitioned buildings. Schools, monasteries, hotels, any structure with walls and a roof became a hospital. German military doctrine assumed time and space: time to evacuate the wounded, space to establish proper facilities. But by 1944, that doctrine had collided with reality. The relentless Allied advance meant German forces were constantly retreating. Medical units found themselves abandoning carefully established hospitals, loading equipment onto trucks, and fleeing before they could treat everyone. Supply lines stretched thin and then broke entirely. Ambulances broke down for lack of spare parts. Morphine ran short. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart in surgeons' hands. And most critically, Germany had no equivalent to what Americans call the golden hour, the concept that wounded soldiers must receive definitive surgical care within the first hour after injury to have the best chance of survival. German military medicine accepted that many wounded would die in transit. It was regrettable, but inevitable. The nature of war. Major Böhler had internalized this reality through years of practice. He had done the best he could with what he had. He had performed amputations without proper anesthesia when supplies ran low. He had watched men die from shock and blood loss while waiting for transport to a rear hospital. He had sutured wounds with silk thread scavenged from parachutes when surgical gut ran out, and he had learned to accept these losses as the cost of war. What he did not know, what he could not have known from within the closed system of the Wehrmacht, was that American military medicine had taken a completely different path. A path that rejected the idea that soldiers must die simply because the hospital was too far away. A path built on the revolutionary concept that the hospital itself could move. The genesis of the American portable hospital system came not from Europe, but from the jungles of the Pacific. In February of 1942, Colonel Percy Carroll, the chief surgeon of U.S. Army forces in the Southwest Pacific, faced a problem. The dense jungle terrain of New Guinea and the lack of roads made it nearly impossible to move large, traditional field hospitals forward with advancing troops. Wounded soldiers were dying not from their injuries, but from the grueling evacuation journey through the jungle to reach medical care. Carroll's solution was radical. Instead of trying to bring the wounded to the hospital, he would bring the hospital to the wounded. He began experimenting with drastically reduced hospital units that could be carried on the backs of the medical staff themselves. 4 officers, 3 surgeons, and an anesthetist, 25 enlisted men, and all their equipment, surgical instruments, and medical supplies could weigh no more than what those 29 men could personally transport. These portable surgical hospitals proved their worth in the brutal fighting at Buna in November and December of 1942. Set up within hours in tents or abandoned huts, often within hearing distance of enemy gunfire, they performed emergency surgeries that saved lives that would have been lost under the old system. Surgeons operated with bullets cracking overhead. Medics triaged casualties while Japanese patrols prowled the perimeter. The mortality rate dropped dramatically. The concept spread. By 1943, the U.S. Army had established 103 portable surgical hospitals across every theater of war. But the system continued to evolve. The original portable hospitals, designed for jungle warfare, had limitations. They lacked capacity. They had minimal post-operative care facilities. They couldn't handle large numbers of casualties. So the Americans developed larger mobile units, field hospitals of 400 beds that could set up in a matter of hours, evacuation hospitals of 750 beds that leapfrogged forward, one passing another as the front advanced, ensuring continuous coverage. And these units didn't just provide basic care. They performed complex surgeries, thoracic procedures, abdominal operations, neurosurgery, all in canvas tents. The key to the system wasn't just mobility, it was standardization and supply. Every field hospital received identical equipment packages. Every surgical team trained on the same procedures. And most critically, every hospital had access to 2 revolutionary medical resources that the Germans simply did not have in adequate quantities: blood, plasma, and penicillin. Blood plasma, the liquid portion of blood separated from red and white blood cells, could be dried, preserved, and transported in powder form. When needed, it was mixed with sterile water and injected to treat shock and blood loss. The American Red Cross, under the direction of Dr. Charles Drew, had established a massive system for collecting, processing, and distributing blood. By 1944, blood banks operated in Britain, supplying fresh whole blood to hospitals across the European theatre. Refrigerated trucks carried blood from these banks directly to field hospitals, often arriving within hours of a battle. German forces had no such system. Blood transfusions in the Wehrmacht were rare, limited to small amounts drawn from other soldiers at the point of need. Many German medical officers believed transfusions over 200 or 300 cubic centimeters were dangerous. The result was predictable. German wounded suffered from untreated shock at vastly higher rates than their American counterparts. Their pallor, the greyish skin tone of profound blood loss, became a distinguishing feature that shocked American medics when they first began treating German prisoners. And then there was penicillin, the British discovery, mass-produced by American pharmaceutical companies using newly developed fermentation processes, represented one of the great medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. By 1944, penicillin was standard issue at every American field hospital. It prevented wound infections with near-miraculous efficiency. Gangrene, the rot of infected tissue that had plagued armies since ancient times, occurred in only 1.5 cases per 1,000 among American troops. Among German wounded, using only sulfur drugs when they were available at all, gangrene struck 20 to 30 per 1,000. The difference meant not just higher survival rates, but faster recovery. American soldiers treated with penicillin returned to duty in half the time it took German soldiers with similar wounds. Major Böhler knew about penicillin. German intelligence had reported on it. German pharmaceutical companies had tried and failed to produce it in meaningful quantities. The chemical company IG Farben, despite its industrial might, never cracked the mass production problem. Penicillin remained, for Germany, a weapon of the enemy as deadly as any tank or bomber. You could not fight what you could not see. And bacterial infection killed as surely as bullets. So when Böhler watched American medics unloading crate after crate of supplies that April morning in Grafenwöhr, his mind began calculating what he was seeing. The refrigerated trucks meant they had whole blood. The systematic organization meant they had adequate supplies of everything else. The speed of setup meant they had done this countless times before. And the calm confidence of the medical staff meant they actually believed this canvas hospital would work. He tried to reconcile it with what he knew. German field hospitals required buildings, solid walls, proper floors that could be kept clean, operating rooms that could be sealed against contamination. Even when the Wehrmacht had controlled most of Europe, even when supplies had been adequate, the medical services had struggled to establish enough facilities to handle casualties from major offensives. Mobile medical care meant battalion aid stations with basic bandaging capability. Real surgery required infrastructure, or so he had always believed. Hauptmann Reinhardt, standing beside him, came from a different background. He had commanded a clearing station, essentially a triage center that determined which wounded would survive transport and which would not. He had seen thousands of men pass through his facility. Some went on to hospitals in the rear, others died waiting, still others died en route. The system functioned, after a fashion, but its waste was staggering. They have more trucks for one hospital than our entire division had for medical transport, Reinhardt said quietly, his eyes tracking the American convoy. Look at that. 8, 9, 10, 12 trucks, just for medical supplies and equipment. We were lucky to have 3. Böhler nodded. The American logistics were impressive, certainly. The question was whether all that material abundance translated into actual medical capability. Could you really perform complex surgery in a tent? Could you maintain sterile technique in the field? Could you manage post-operative patients without proper facilities? Or were the Americans, for all their resources, simply engaging in expensive theatre that would prove less effective than the German system's emphasis on moving wounded to permanent facilities? The answer came sooner than Böhler expected. 2 hours after the convoy arrived, the hospital was operational. The tents stood in precise rows. Electric lines ran from the generators to each tent. Water tanks provided clean water for scrubbing and sterilization. And then the wounded began arriving. American soldiers, casualties from skirmishes with German holdouts in the surrounding forests. But also German wounded. Prisoners taken in the same engagements, loaded into the same ambulances, delivered to the same hospital. Böhler watched as American medics carried a German private on a stretcher into the receiving tent. The man's abdomen was torn open from shrapnel. He was grey with shock, his breathing shallow and rapid. Under Wehrmacht doctrine, such a wound meant immediate triage to the expectant category, those expected to die. Treatment would be palliative, keep him comfortable, give him morphine. Move on to those who could be saved. But the Americans didn't move on. The young man disappeared into the surgical tent. And then, 15 minutes later, Böhler saw something that made his medical training war with his eyes. He saw surgeons, already gowned and gloved, beginning an emergency laparotomy, opening the abdomen, in a tent, in a field hospital that had been assembled in under 3 hours. And they weren't just attempting it, they were doing it properly. He could see, even from a distance, the organized movements, the surgical drapes, the instrument trays, the anesthesia equipment, all the elements of a proper operating theatre assembled in canvas. Impossible, Böhler whispered again. But this time, the word sounded different. Less like a certainty, more like a prayer that what he believed about the world might still be true, even as evidence mounted that everything he thought he knew was wrong. The operation continued for 2 hours. During that time, 3 more patients entered the surgical tent. 2 American soldiers with gunshot wounds, another German with a shattered femur. The surgical teams, working in rotation, moved through the cases with practiced efficiency. No chaos, no rushing, just steady, competent work. When the German private emerged from surgery, alive, stable, being carried to a recovery ward, Böhler felt something shift in his understanding of medicine and war. Not just tactical knowledge, but something deeper. The fundamental assumptions about what was possible and what was fantasy. The Americans had not performed a miracle. They had performed standard battlefield surgery. But they had done it in conditions that German medical doctrine declared unsuitable. They had done it quickly. And they had done it while also treating their own wounded, suggesting they could sustain this level of care continuously, not just as a one-time demonstration. Over the next week, as more wounded arrived and the field hospital continued operating, Böhler began asking questions. Not of the German officers around him, NAT Neo, they were as shocked as he was, but of anyone who would listen. Guards, medics. Eventually, a young American medical officer who spoke enough German to explain the basics. The answers he received challenged everything he had learned in German medical schools and military training. The tents weren't unsanitary. The Americans used chemical sterilization techniques that created conditions as clean as any permanent operating room. They had developed specialized tent designs with filtered ventilation systems. They had protocols for everything, written down in field manuals that every medic and nurse could reference. The blood supply wasn't fragile or unreliable. It was industrial. Blood banks in Britain processed thousands of donations daily. Refrigerated supply chains moved blood and plasma forward with the same efficiency they moved ammunition. No field hospital went without adequate supplies. The penicillin wasn't rationed or reserved for the most critical cases. It was standard. Every wounded soldier received it as a matter of course. The Americans had solved the production problem so thoroughly that they could treat their enemies with it. And the speed of setup wasn't reckless. It was rehearsed. These medical units practiced deployment constantly. They had timed drills. They had standardized layouts that every member knew by heart. What looked impossible to German observers was, to American medical staff, simply their job. For Major Heinrich Böhler, trained in the meticulous traditions of German medicine, raised in a military system that valued hierarchy and doctrine, this revelation cut deeper than any tactical defeat. The Americans hadn't won through some clever trick or lucky innovation. They had won by rejecting the fundamental assumptions that governed German military medicine. They had looked at the problem of battlefield casualties and asked a different question. Not, how do we move the wounded to hospitals? But how do we move hospitals to the wounded? And having asked that question, they had engineered a comprehensive answer that drew on American industrial capacity, scientific advancement, and organizational capability. The portable hospital was more than a medical facility. It was a symbol of everything the Wehrmacht had failed to grasp about modern warfare. That logistics could outweigh valor, that organization could defeat ideology, that a nation's industrial power, properly directed, could save more lives than the most skilled surgeon with inadequate supplies. Böhler would spend the rest of his captivity trying to understand what he had witnessed, trying to reconcile the doctor he had been, conscientious, skilled, doing his best with limited resources, with the doctor he might have been in a different system, one that valued saving soldiers' lives above maintaining doctrinal purity, one that asked, "What if we could?" instead of, "This is how it's done." The irony was almost poetic. The Wehrmacht had believed its medical system was efficient, practical, realistic. It had mocked Allied forces as wasteful, throwing resources at problems that discipline and will could solve. But when Böhler stood in that field in Bavaria, watching surgeons save lives in canvas tents, he understood the truth. Sometimes what looks impossible is simply a failure of imagination. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of Major Böhler's understanding didn't happen in a single moment of revelation. It unfolded over weeks, through dozens of observations, each one chipping away at certainties he had held for years. And he wasn't alone. Across Germany in the spring of 1945, as American forces advanced and established field hospitals in liberated towns and captured territories, thousands of German medical personnel experienced the same disorienting collision with a system that operated on entirely different principles. Oberarzt Franz Kellermann had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front. He had operated in field hospitals established in abandoned schools, in requisitioned manor houses, in the basement of a brewery outside Stalingrad. He had learned to work with shortages so severe that surgical gloves were washed and reused until they developed holes. Anesthesia was rationed to the most critical cases. Everyone else received local anesthetics, or, when those ran out, a leather strap to bite down on, and the whispered reassurance that the pain would be over soon. When Kellermann was captured near Leipzig in April of 1945, he had been without supplies for 2 weeks. His medical unit had abandoned most of its equipment during the retreat. What remained fit into 3 wooden crates, bandages, a few surgical instruments, some morphine syrettes. Not enough to treat a single day's casualties properly, but enough to provide comfort to the dying. The American field hospital that processed him as a prisoner operated out of a converted factory, but it had been supplemented with portable surgical units set up in the factory yard. Kellermann watched, initially with professional skepticism, as American surgeons performed an emergency thoracotomy in one of the tents, opening the chest cavity, repairing damage to the lung, all in the open air, with only canvas walls separating the operating table from the April wind. "They will kill him," Kellermann muttered to another captured German doctor standing beside him. "Pneumothorax in field conditions. It's suicide. The infection rate will be catastrophic." But the patient didn't die. He survived the surgery, received penicillin, and was walking within a week. And when Kellermann finally found an American medical officer willing to explain the procedure, the explanation only deepened his confusion. "We use positive pressure anesthesia," the American doctor said in halting German, "keeps the lungs inflated during surgery, and we have protocols for sterile technique in field conditions. Every surface is sterilized, every instrument is autoclaved. We've been doing thoracic surgery in tents since North Africa. It works," Kellermann wanted to argue, wanted to explain why this violated basic medical principles. But the evidence stood before him, breathing and recovering. Theory had collided with practice, and practice had won decisively. The German medical system had been built on the foundation of permanent infrastructure. You needed buildings to maintain sterility. You needed established supply lines to ensure adequate materials. You needed time to evacuate patients to facilities equipped for complex procedures. This wasn't ideology. It was practical reality, confirmed by centuries of military medical practice, or so it had seemed. What Kellermann and Böhler and thousands of other German medical officers were discovering was that the Americans had simply refused to accept those limitations as permanent. They had asked whether technology and organization could overcome what had always been considered immutable constraints, and they had systematically solved each problem. Sterility in tents? They developed portable autoclaves that could sterilize instruments in the field. They created chemical sterilization procedures for surfaces. They designed tent layouts with separate clean and contaminated zones. They trained every staff member in protocols that were followed religiously, not casually. Anesthesia in field conditions? They developed portable anesthesia machines that could deliver precise mixtures of oxygen and ether. They trained anesthetists specifically for field work. They standardized procedures so that anesthesia could be administered safely even in suboptimal conditions. Blood supply in forward areas? They built the infrastructure. Blood banks in Britain collected and processed blood daily. Refrigerated trucks moved it forward. Field hospitals maintained supplies sufficient for any expected casualty load. When supplies ran low, more arrived, within hours. Every problem that the Wehrmacht had accepted as an unavoidable cost of war, the Americans treated as an engineering challenge to be solved. And they brought to bear the full weight of American industrial and scientific capacity to solve it. The portable hospital ward tents themselves were marvels of practical design. 16 feet wide, 50 feet long, 12 feet high at the center, hip-roofed for drainage and stability in wind. Each tent could house 20 canvas cots or 25 litters. Ventilation came through carefully designed openings that allowed air circulation without compromising weather protection. When cold weather required it, portable stoves provided heat without creating fire hazards. The surgical tents were even more sophisticated. Operating tables that could be assembled quickly but remained stable during procedures. Lighting systems powered by portable generators that provided illumination equal to permanent facilities. Instrument tables, sterilization equipment, anesthesia apparatus, all designed to be broken down, transported, and reassembled without loss of functionality. And crucially, these weren't improvised solutions. They were mass-produced, standardized systems. An evacuation hospital in France had identical equipment to one in Italy or the Pacific. Surgeons could transfer between units without retraining. Supply officers knew exactly what each hospital type required. The entire medical system operated with industrial precision. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late April of 1945, Major Böhler had been given permission to assist in the American field hospital at Grafenwohr. The Americans needed German-speaking medical staff to help treat the thousands of German wounded who continued to arrive as resistance collapsed. Böhler found himself working alongside American surgeons, nurses, and medics, observing their methods firsthand. What struck him most wasn't the technology, impressive as it was. It was the philosophy underlying everything. The Americans operated on the assumption that every life could be saved if given proper treatment quickly enough. Not every life would be saved. Medicine had limits, but the goal was to push those limits as far as possible. No soldier died simply because treatment wasn't available or because doctrine said certain procedures couldn't be performed in field conditions. German military medicine had operated on a different principle, triage based on probability of survival and military utility. Resources were limited, so they were allocated to those most likely to return to combat. The severely wounded were made comfortable but often received minimal aggressive treatment. It was rational, it was efficient, it maximized the fighting strength of the army, but it also meant accepting death as the default outcome for many categories of wounded. And standing in that American field hospital, watching surgeons spend hours saving a German private with a shattered pelvis, a wound that would have been triaged as expectant in any Wehrmacht facility, Böhler began to question whether efficiency had been measured against the right values. The Americans saved that soldier not because he would return to combat. The war was ending. He would be a prisoner regardless. They saved him because they could, and because their system was built on the principle that medical resources existed to save lives, not to optimize military outcomes. It was a subtle distinction, but it revealed a profound difference in how the two systems understood the relationship between medicine and warfare. One evening, as Böhler worked late helping with a difficult case, a German officer with extensive abdominal injuries from an artillery blast, an American surgical nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, struck up a conversation during a break. Her German was limited, his English nearly non-existent, but they managed through a combination of both languages and medical Latin. "In your medical service?" she asked. Did you have enough supplies? Before everything collapsed. Böhler considered the question carefully. We had supplies. Not like this. He gestured at the well-stocked shelves around them. But enough. We managed. Did you have penicillin? Very little. Mostly sulfur drugs. Sometimes not even those. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, arranging instruments on a tray. We were told that German medicine was very advanced, that your doctors were excellent. They are, Böhler said, feeling defensive. German medical training is rigorous. Our surgeons are skilled. I believe you, Mitchell said. But your system, why didn't it give you the tools you needed? The question cut to the heart of what Böhler had been wrestling with for weeks. Why hadn't Germany developed these systems? They had excellent chemists who could have worked on penicillin production. They had engineering expertise that could have designed portable hospitals. They had medical schools that produced skilled physicians. The answer, he was beginning to understand, wasn't about capability. It was about priorities and philosophy. Germany had poured its industrial capacity into tanks and aircraft and rockets. Medical services received what was left over, and the military medical doctrine had accepted limitations rather than challenging them, had optimized existing systems rather than revolutionizing them. The Americans had made different choices. They had decided that medical care was as important as ammunition. They had invested in medical research, in industrial production of drugs and equipment, in training personnel and developing systems. And they had approached battlefield medicine with the same innovative spirit they brought to every other aspect of warfare. I think, Böhler said slowly, searching for words in a language that wasn't his own, we did not believe it was possible. What you have done here, we thought it required. We thought walls and buildings were necessary. We did not imagine this could work. Mitchell nodded. Neither did we, at first, but we tried anyway, and we kept improving until it did work. That exchange stayed with Böhler long after the war ended. We did not believe it was possible, versus we tried anyway. It encapsulated the difference between two systems, two philosophies, two ways of approaching problems. The German medical system had been constrained by tradition and doctrine. What had always been done shaped what was believed to be possible. Innovation happened slowly, within established frameworks. When the war demanded more than the system could provide, the response was to work harder within existing constraints, not to challenge the constraints themselves. The American system, by contrast, seemed to operate on the assumption that constraints were temporary. If something needed to be done, then ways would be found to do it. If existing methods didn't work, new methods would be developed. The system was dynamic, experimental, willing to fail and iterate until success was achieved. This difference manifested in countless small ways that Böhler observed during his time working alongside American medical staff. When a sterilization procedure proved inadequate, Americans didn't simply accept it and work around the limitation. They brought in specialists, analyzed the problem, and developed a better procedure. When supply delays threatened to leave a field hospital without adequate penicillin, the logistics system responded by establishing forward supply dumps and redundant delivery routes. The American military medical system was designed to learn and adapt continuously. Field hospitals submitted regular reports on procedures, outcomes, and challenges. Innovations developed by one unit were tested and, if effective, distributed to all units. Medical officers rotated through different assignments, spreading knowledge and best practices. The entire apparatus functioned as a learning organization that got better with time. By contrast, the Wehrmacht medical service had ossified. Procedures established in peacetime remained largely unchanged throughout the war. Innovations were local and rarely spread systematically. When problems emerged, supply shortages, inadequate transportation, insufficient personnel, the response was to make do, to struggle through, to accept degraded performance rather than fundamentally rethinking the system. Part of this difference stemmed from resources. America's vast industrial capacity allowed for experimentation and redundancy that Germany simply couldn't match, but resources alone didn't explain it. The Soviet Union, facing similar resource constraints to Germany, had developed innovative battlefield medical techniques, including highly mobile medical units and extensive use of female physicians. The Soviets had been willing to challenge convention when necessity demanded it. Germany's problem was deeper than resources. It was cultural. The Wehrmacht valued hierarchy, tradition, and established expertise. Innovation was encouraged within narrow parameters but viewed with suspicion when it challenged fundamental assumptions. Medical officers like Böhler were trained to work within the system, not to imagine alternatives to it. And so, when faced with the unprecedented challenges of total war, the German medical system had bent under the strain but hadn't transformed. It had become less effective as the war progressed, not more. Casualty rates increased, survival rates decreased, and medical personnel burned out, overwhelmed by demands they lacked the tools to meet. The American system, built on different principles, had moved in the opposite direction. Early in the war, American battlefield medicine had been adequate but not exceptional. By 1945, it was the most effective military medical system in history. Mortality rates for wounded soldiers treated by American field hospitals had dropped to 3% compared to 8% in World War I and 25% in the American Civil War. That improvement wasn't accidental. It was the result of systematic investment, continuous innovation, and a philosophy that refused to accept limitations as permanent. Hauptmann Reinhardt, the clearing station commander, had a slightly different reaction to the American medical system than Böhler. Where Böhler focused on surgical techniques and procedures, Reinhardt was fascinated by logistics and organization. He had spent the war trying to manage impossible problems: too many wounded, too few ambulances, too little fuel, inadequate roads, constant shortages of everything. When he examined the American field hospital's operation, what impressed him most wasn't the surgery. It was how smoothly everything flowed. Wounded arrived at receiving. They were triaged efficiently. Those needing immediate surgery went directly to pre-op. Others went to medical wards or shock treatment areas. After surgery, patients moved to recovery wards where nurses monitored them continuously. Supplies flowed in one direction, casualties in another, and the two streams never interfered with each other. It was choreographed, rehearsed, optimized, and it worked with a smoothness that Reinhardt had never seen in any Wehrmacht medical facility. "They have fewer people than we did," he told Böhler one evening. "That field hospital has maybe 40 officers and 200 enlisted personnel. My clearing station had similar numbers, but they do more with those people, much more." "How?" Böhler asked. "Organization. Everyone knows their role precisely. There are written protocols for everything, and their equipment is designed for the task. Our medical equipment was modified from civilian use. Theirs is purpose-built for military field, medicine. Every piece fits together with every other piece. It's a system, not a collection of improvised solutions." Reinhardt had put his finger on something crucial. The American portable hospital wasn't just advanced equipment. It was an integrated system where every element had been designed with every other element in mind. The tents fit on specific trucks. The generator provided exactly the power needed for the lighting and equipment. The sterilization equipment matched the instruments. The supply chains delivered exactly what each type of hospital required. German medical services, like much of the Wehrmacht, had been built on improvisation and adaptation. Officers were expected to figure out solutions to problems as they arose. This created flexibility, but also chaos. No two facilities operated quite the same way. Best practices developed in one location rarely spread to others. And when systems broke down, as they increasingly did as the war progressed, there was no robust framework to maintain functionality. The Americans had built redundancy and resilience into their system. If one supply route was cut, alternatives existed. If equipment failed, replacements were available. If personnel were lost, the system continued functioning because procedures were documented and standardized. It was, Reinhardt realized, the same principle that made American industrial production so formidable, the same assembly line thinking that produced thousands of identical bombers or tanks had been applied to medical care. Standardization enabled mass production, training, and deployment. And the result was a medical system that could be scaled to treat hundreds of thousands of casualties while maintaining quality and effectiveness. As April turned to May and Germany's surrender became inevitable, the American field hospitals began treating primarily German wounded. American casualties dropped as fighting wound down, but German casualties continued from bombing, artillery, fire, and the chaos of military collapse. Thousands of German soldiers, often in desperate condition after weeks without proper medical care, flooded into American facilities. What they found there challenged everything they had been told about their enemies. The Americans didn't mistreat prisoners. They didn't withhold care or provide substandard treatment. German wounded received the same penicillin, the same blood transfusions, the same surgical procedures as American soldiers. In some cases, they received better care than they ever had in Wehrmacht facilities. A young German soldier named Private Anton Weber, captured with severe wounds to his leg and abdomen, later wrote about his experience. "I expected to die. The wounds were too severe, and I was the enemy. Why would they waste medicine on me? But they operated immediately. They gave me blood, I don't know how much, but they kept bringing more bottles. And they gave me injections that fought infection. Within days, I felt stronger. Within 2 weeks, I could walk with assistance. The American doctor told me I would survive, that I would keep my leg. In our army, I would have lost the leg at minimum, probably my life." Weber's experience was repeated thousands of times across Germany in the spring and summer of 1945. German wounded discovered that American medicine wasn't propaganda or theatre. It was real, effective, and delivered without regard to nationality. The portable hospitals that seemed impossible actually worked better than the permanent facilities Germany had relied on. For the German medical officers who witnessed this, the experience was humbling and revelatory. They had believed in the superiority of German medicine, German science, German organization. They had accepted that shortages and difficulties were simply the reality of war, that no system could overcome them. And they had internalized the idea that their medical doctrine represented the best possible approach to battlefield medicine. All of these beliefs crumbled when confronted with a system that operated on entirely different principles and achieved dramatically better outcomes. The Americans hadn't won through some mystical advantage or lucky circumstances. They had won through better systems, better organization, better prioritization, and better innovation. Major Böhler remained in Germany after the war, eventually returning to medical practice in civilian life. He became an advocate for modernizing German medical practices, drawing on what he had learned from the Americans. He pushed for standardization of procedures, investment in antibiotics and blood banking, and emphasis on emergency medicine. But he also carried with him a deeper lesson. He had learned that what seems impossible is often simply a failure to imagine alternatives. That tradition and doctrine can blind you to better ways of doing things. That systems and organization matter as much as individual skill, and that the most dangerous assumption in any field is that current practices represent the limits of what can be achieved. In his later writings, he reflected on that April morning in 1945, when he first saw American soldiers unloading canvas and poles in a Bavarian field. "I said it was impossible," he wrote, "and I meant it. My training, my experience, my understanding of medicine all told me that what I was about to witness could not work. But I was wrong. Not about the medicine I knew, but about the medicine I hadn't imagined." The Americans didn't ignore the challenges of field surgery. They solved them. Systematically, thoroughly, comprehensively. They asked, "How can we?" instead of "We cannot." And in doing so, they revolutionized military medicine. The portable hospitals that seemed impossible to German observers in 1945 would become the foundation for modern battlefield medicine. The mobile army surgical hospital units of the Korean War, made famous by the television series MASH, were direct descendants of the portable surgical hospitals developed in World War II. The medevac helicopters and forward surgical teams of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan all drew on the same principle: bring sophisticated medical care as close to the point of injury as possible, and do it quickly. The golden hour, the concept that trauma patients need definitive care within 60 minutes of injury, became a cornerstone of both military and civilian emergency medicine. Paramedics, trauma centers, air ambulances all operate on principles first developed and proven in those canvas hospitals erected in fields from France to the Philippines. Blood banking, once an experimental procedure, became standard worldwide. Antibiotics, pioneered on a massive scale by American military medicine, transformed the treatment of infectious disease globally. The standardized protocols and training methods developed for military field hospitals influenced civilian medical education and practice for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy was philosophical rather than technical. The American portable hospital system proved that constraints are not absolute. That innovation can overcome limitations previously thought insurmountable. That the question isn't whether something is possible, but whether we're willing to invest the resources and imagination necessary to make it possible. When German officers said, "This is impossible," while watching canvas hospitals rise in hours and perform surgeries they believed required permanent infrastructure, they were expressing more than skepticism about a particular technology. They were expressing a worldview that accepted limitations as given, that valued tradition over innovation, that prioritized doctrine over results. The Americans had proven that worldview wrong, not through ideological arguments, but through practical demonstration. The hospitals worked, the surgeries succeeded, the mortality rates dropped, and thousands of soldiers, American and German alike, survived wounds that would have killed them in any previous war. In the end, the story of the portable hospitals is about more than medicine or military logistics. It's about how we approach problems. Do we accept constraints as permanent, or do we treat them as challenges to overcome? Do we say, "This is how things are," or do we ask, "How could things be better?" Do we work within existing systems, or do we build new systems when existing ones prove inadequate? The Americans chose innovation over tradition, invested resources in solving problems, and created systems that could scale and improve. The Germans chose tradition over innovation, rationed scarce resources, and accepted degraded performance as inevitable. The difference in outcomes wasn't subtle. Today, when trauma surgeons treat victims of accidents or violence, when military medics stabilize wounded soldiers in forward operating bases, when paramedics respond to emergencies with sophisticated equipment and protocols, they are benefiting from the revolution that began in those canvas hospitals. The revolution that German officers said was impossible. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come not from accepting what is, but from imagining what could be. The American portable hospitals taught that lesson to a generation of German medical officers who had believed they understood the limits of battlefield medicine. They discovered those limits could be pushed far beyond what they had imagined. All it required was the audacity to try, the resources to experiment, and the persistence to keep improving until the impossible became routine. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.